He told his friends he had no regrets, but the way his hands trembled over an untouched drink exposed him before he could finish the lie. The woman he abandoned was no longer waiting. And now every quiet moment was pulling him deeper into a spiral he could not control. Across the table, his closest friend watched his phone light up for the third time. "You going to check it again?" He flipped the phone face down. "It's nothing." His friend leaned back. "Then why have you opened her profile 6 times tonight?" The question landed harder than he expected. For a moment, he said nothing. His eyes moved toward the window, then back to the drink he had not touched. He wanted to laugh it off. He wanted to repeat the confident speech he had given everyone after the breakup. He was free. He was relieved. He had finally chosen himself, but confidence sounds different when it is real. His had begun to sound rehearsed. Weeks earlier, he had told those same friends that leaving her was the easiest decision he had ever made. He claimed she had become too familiar, too predictable, too emotionally demanding. Every flaw they pointed out became proof that he deserved something better. What he never admitted was how quickly he started believing them. As a psychological symbol, the reversed 5 of Pentacles captured the truth he refused to face. The loss was not only about being shut out, it was about realizing the door had never truly been closed. He had walked away from warmth, then blamed the cold for finding him. At first, he enjoyed the attention. He stayed out late. He answered messages from people who barely knew him. He laughed louder around his friends and made sure everyone heard him say he was happier. But that was not what finally broke him. What broke him was her silence. She did not beg. She did not flood his phone with long messages. She did not ask his friends to speak for her. She disappeared from the role he expected her to keep playing. And when she stopped chasing, he started checking. At first, it was once a week. Then every few days. Then every night before sleep. He told himself he was only curious. His friends knew better. Because each time her name appeared on his screen, his face changed before his mouth could deny anything. His friend watched the change happen again. The slight tightening around his mouth. The quick glance toward the screen. The hand that moved before he remembered he was supposed to look indifferent. "You know what time she usually comes online," his friend said. He gave a short laugh. So you checked at 9:14, then 9:27, then again when she still hadn't posted anything. His fingers closed around the glass, but he did not lift it. "That doesn't mean anything." His friend nodded slowly. "And the new picture?" "What new picture?" "The one you noticed 3 minutes after she changed it." This time he looked away. He had noticed the smaller details too. The old photograph she removed, the song she stopped using, the caption that disappeared without being replaced. Each change became a message in his mind, even when none of it was meant for him. Maybe she wanted him to notice. Maybe she was trying to look happy. Maybe the silence was punishment. He could create an explanation for everything except the most obvious one. She was moving through her life without consulting him. "I'm just paying attention," he said. "No," his friend replied. "You're looking for proof that she still thinks about you." The words settled between them. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of his phone, once. Then again. His breathing remained steady, but the movement did not. Regret rarely introduces itself honestly. It does not always arrive as an apology or a confession. Sometimes it arrives as constant observation. A person watches from a distance, calls it curiosity, and refuses to admit that indifference would not require this much effort. The Page of Swords reflected that restless state perfectly, not as a prediction, but as a psychological mirror, a mind standing guard over information it cannot control, alert, suspicious, searching every small detail for an answer that silence refuses to provide. He had become a witness to her life, but he no longer had a place inside it. "She hasn't blocked me," he said quietly. His friend's expression changed. "You've said that 4 times this week." That means something. It means she hasn't blocked you. He leaned back, jaw tightening. You don't know her. I know you. The phone lit up again. He did not touch it this time, but his eyes dropped toward the table before he could stop them. His friend followed the movement. You're not checking because you miss her, he said. You're checking because you're waiting for her to prove you still matter. For the first time that night, he had nothing prepared. No joke, no denial, no speech about freedom. His friend lowered his voice, and the profile isn't the worst part. He finally looked up. What are you talking about? His friend held his gaze. I know what you've been doing every night after everyone goes to sleep. His shoulders stiffened. You don't know what I do. His friend reached for his own phone, tapped the screen and turned it across the table. A notification sat there from 3 nights earlier. You awake? He recognized the time immediately. 2:46 in the morning. You sent me that, his friend said, then deleted it before I answered. He stared at the message. The room around them seemed louder now. Glasses touching tables. A chair dragging across the floor. Someone laughing near the door. None of it reached him, his friend continued. You only text that late when you've been reading the old conversation again. He opened his mouth, but the denial came too slowly. That was enough. Every night followed almost the same pattern. He waited until the room was dark. He lowered the brightness on his phone. Then he opened the message thread he had promised himself he would delete. He never started at the beginning. He searched for the soft parts. The voice note where she laughed halfway through a sentence. The message where she told him to drive safely. The night she stayed awake because he had said he could not sleep. He replayed those moments until they felt current. Then he avoided everything that came after. The unanswered questions, the apologies she made for needing clarity. The message where she asked why affection had begun to feel like something she had to earn. Those were harder to revisit because they did not support the version of the breakup he preferred. So he scrolled past them. He told himself he was remembering. What he was really doing was editing. The reversed 4 of Pentacles reflected that private ritual. Not as fortune-telling, but as a psychological symbol of someone losing control while gripping tighter. He had released the relationship, yet he kept clutching its remains, preserving only the pieces that allowed him to feel wanted. Some nights he typed to her, I was just thinking about you. Delete. Hope you're doing okay. Delete. Do you ever miss us? Delete. The empty draft stayed illuminated in the dark long after the words were gone. He never sent anything. Sending it would risk an answer. And an answer might force him to face what silence still allowed him to imagine. His friend studied him across the table. You're not reading those messages to understand what happened. He looked down. You're reading them because you're trying to find a different ending. His thumb moved toward the screen again. This time he opened the thread. He wanted to prove his friend wrong. He scrolled past the voice notes, past the photographs, past the final argument he had rewritten so many times in his head that he no longer remembered which words were real. Then he stopped. There was a message from her sent 3 days before he left. He had read it as criticism then. Now, staring at it without the anger he had used to protect himself, he finally understood what she had actually been trying to tell him. The message was shorter than he remembered. Do you still want to build this with me? That was all. No accusation, no demand, no attempt to control where he went or who he spoke to. She had simply noticed that every time his friends questioned the relationship, he came back colder. He answered later, much later. Not because he was busy, but because he wanted her to feel that he was not waiting for her. He had seen the message immediately, placed the phone beside him, and let the silence do what he was too afraid to say directly. When he finally replied, he made a joke. Something about her overthinking again. At the time, he called it keeping things light. Now it looked different. It looked like cruelty disguised as calm. His friend watched his eyes move over the screen. What did she say? He did not answer. He remembered the days before that message, the way she had begun choosing her words carefully around him, the way she paused before asking simple questions, as though she already expected him to make her regret them. He remembered showing one of her private messages to the group. They laughed at how serious she sounded. He laughed too. Then he went home and acted irritated when she asked why he seemed distant. She had not been asking for constant attention. She was asking whether he was still participating, whether the relationship still belonged to both of them. The Eight of Pentacles reflected what he had refused to understand. Love was not supposed to survive on intention alone. It required attention, repetition. The quiet willingness to keep showing up when no one was watching. She had been trying to repair something. He had treated the repair as pressure. An open hand had felt like a chain, because accepting it would have required effort. He scrolled upward. There were more signs now that he was willing to see them. Her asking whether they could talk without his friends being involved. Her saying she felt as though she was competing with opinions from people who did not know what happened between them. Her apologizing after he accused her of creating problems. He had mistaken her fear for manipulation, her patience for dependence, her final attempt for another reason to leave. Missing her was painful. But seeing himself from her side was worse. Because regret was no longer about what he had lost. It was about what she had endured while he convinced himself he was the one being trapped. His thumb hovered over the date beneath her message. Then he noticed it. The exact night she had asked whether he still wanted to build with her was the same night his friends had told him to stop trying, to pull back, to make her prove how much she wanted him, to see how little he could give before she finally walked away. At the time, it had sounded harmless. Stop trying so hard. Let her come to you. Don't let her get comfortable. They had said it casually, passing advice across the table as though love were a negotiation and attention was something a person should ration. He remembered nodding. He remembered how relieved he felt when they agreed with the resentment he had not yet admitted. The next morning, he saw her message and waited 2 hours before answering. Not because he needed space. Because they had told him that answering too quickly made him look invested. Later, when she reached for his hand, he pulled away just enough for her to notice. When she asked whether something was wrong, he said she was imagining it. Each reaction became part of the test. If she asked questions, she was insecure. If she stayed quiet, she did not care enough. If she tried harder, he felt powerful. If she stopped trying, he called the relationship empty. His friend looked down at the table. We thought she was controlling you. You told me she was. We were wrong. His jaw tightened. So this is your fault now. No. The answer came without hesitation. You listened. You chose what to do with it. The glass remained between his hands. The ice had nearly disappeared, thinning the drink he still had not tasted. His friend continued carefully. We liked giving advice because it made us feel like we understood something. And every time you pulled away and she reacted, it made us feel right. He wanted to argue. He wanted to remind him that no one had forced him to ignore her calls or share her private words. No one had taken the phone from his hand and typed those dismissive replies. But that was exactly the problem. They had influenced him. He had carried it out. The reversed Seven of Pentacles reflected the damage more clearly than he wanted to admit. Not as a prediction, but as a symbol of impatience turning into sabotage. He had stopped tending the relationship, watched it weaken, then used the lack of growth as proof that it had never been worth the effort. He did not leave because there was nothing there. He created the distance. Then he blamed her for standing far away. The timing of her message made that truth impossible to avoid. While she was asking whether they could keep building, He had already decided to measure how much pain she would tolerate before giving up. His friend's voice softened. "There's something else." He looked up slowly. "What?" "She spoke to me after the breakup." His grip tightened around the glass. "When?" "Once." About 2 weeks later, he searched his friend's face for the answer he wanted. Anger, revenge, a secret request to bring him back. But his friend shook his head before he could ask. "She didn't call to fight about you." He paused. "And she didn't ask me to help her get you back." His friend waited before continuing. "She said she finally understood something." He said nothing. "She said you needed to lose access to her before you could understand what you had." His eyes narrowed. "That sounds like something you told her to say." "I didn't. So she was trying to punish me." "No." The answer came quietly. "She was trying to stop punishing herself." He looked down at the old message still open on his phone. For a moment, suspicion protected him. It gave him somewhere easier to stand. Maybe she wanted him to hear this. Maybe she knew his friend would repeat it. Maybe the silence had always been a strategy. But his friend's expression did not change. "She said you confused loving her with being able to reach her whenever you needed something." His jaw tightened. "That's not true, isn't it?" He wanted to answer immediately. He could not. Because when work went badly, he called her. When he doubted himself, he waited for her reassurance. When his friends disappointed him, he returned to her warmth as though it belonged to him permanently. She listened. She remembered. She made room. Even after he began withdrawing, he still expected her to answer with the same softness. He wanted distance without losing comfort, freedom without losing access, an ending without the absence that followed it. The Queen of Pentacles reflected what she had been in his life. Not as a prediction, but as a psychological symbol of steady care. A person who created safety through small, repeated acts and asked only that the safety be respected. He had mistaken that steadiness for availability. He thought the light would remain on because it always had before. His friend leaned forward. "She said you didn't miss her yet." His face changed. "What does that mean?" "She said you missed knowing she was there." The words moved through him slowly. He remembered the first night he almost called after the breakup. He had been frustrated, restless, unable to sleep. His thumb found her name without thought. He stopped only because he did not know what right. He still had to press it. That was the part he had never admitted. He did not only miss her voice, he missed being received. He missed the certainty that somewhere, behind a door he had chosen to leave, someone still understood him. But she had stopped standing there, not to make him suffer, to keep herself from becoming a place he visited only when the rest of his life felt cold. His friend looked toward the phone in his hand. "She asked me for one thing." He lifted his eyes. "If you ever came back just because the silence scared you, she didn't want any of us helping you reach her." For several seconds, he did not move. The request felt unfair until he understood why she had made it. She knew the difference between being missed and being needed for relief. His friend watched him carefully. "What would you say to her if she answered tonight?" He looked at the blank message field. The question should have been simple. It was not. Would he ask whether she missed him? Whether she was talking to someone else? Why she had disappeared so completely? Each question reached toward her. None of them reached toward what he had done. He typed slowly. "I've been thinking about everything." He read it twice. "Delete. I didn't expect things to end like this. Delete. Can we talk?" His thumb stayed above the screen. That one was harder to erase because it sounded reasonable. But beneath it was the same demand. "Give me access. Give me an answer. Make this uncertainty stop." He deleted it too. His friend said nothing. The silence forced him to hear the difference between apology and loneliness. An apology asked what she needed. Loneliness asked her to return and fix what her absence had exposed. He wanted to believe this was love. Maybe part of it was. But love was not the only thing moving inside him. There was panic. There was wounded pride. There was the fear that someone else might one day receive the care he had treated as permanent. The Page of Pentacles reflected the lesson he had avoided, not as a prediction, but as a psychological symbol of beginning again with humility, holding one truth carefully, studying it instead of assuming mastery. He had spent weeks searching for the perfect message. What he lacked was not language, it was honesty. His friend leaned back. "You keep asking whether she would answer." He stared at the empty draft. "You haven't asked whether hearing from you would hurt her." That sentence remained after everything else had been deleted. His hand loosened around the phone. For the first time, that wanting another chance did not automatically make him ready for one. Remorse was not the same as repair. Missing her was not proof that he had changed, and fear of being replaced was not love, no matter how much it hurt. He locked the screen and placed the phone face down beside the untouched drink. Then it vibrated. Once, he tried not to look. He lasted 3 seconds. When he turned the screen over, her profile had changed again. A new photograph filled the display. She was standing somewhere he did not recognize, surrounded by faces he had never seen, smiling without hesitation. There was no old necklace, no familiar room, no trace of him anywhere in the frame. He enlarged the photograph. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her smile reached her eyes. One hand rested against a painted wall covered in colors. She used to talk about, before the relationship consumed most of her attention. He remembered that version of her. The woman who made plans without asking whether he approved. The woman who stayed curious. The woman who laughed before checking his face to see whether she was being too much. Somewhere along the way, that expression had changed around him. Not suddenly. Gradually, she had begun making herself smaller to avoid another dismissive look. She stopped mentioning the classes she wanted to take because he called them unrealistic. She shared less because he had started treating enthusiasm like another demand on his time. Now, none of that hesitation was visible. He read the caption, nothing about healing, nothing about the breakup, just a few words about completing a project she had once abandoned. He checked the date, then the comments, then every face standing beside her. He opened the profiles of people he did not recognize and searched for connections that might explain why she looked so content. Maybe the photograph was staged. Maybe she had posted it because she knew he would see it. Maybe the smile disappeared as soon as the camera did. His friend watched him move from one detail to the next. "You're trying to find sadness because it would make you feel important." He stopped scrolling. "That's not what I'm doing." "Then why can't you accept that she looks happy?" The reversed Queen of Cups reflected the fear beneath his searching. Not as a prediction, but as a psychological symbol of emotion turned inward until care becomes self-protection. She had spent too long pouring understanding into someone who kept questioning its value. Now she was keeping some of it for herself. That was what disturbed him. Not another man, not competition. Peace. He had expected recovery to leave evidence of him behind. A bitter caption, a hidden reference. A photograph that looked almost happy, but not completely. Instead, she had posted a moment that did not seem to require his interpretation. Her life had continued, and he had no role in the scene. He zoomed in once more, studying the ease in her face. She was not waiting to be chosen. She was not trying to prove that she had survived. She was simply present in a life that had begun expanding after he left it. His fear was no longer that she might love someone else. It was that she had learned to love her days without him. He lowered the phone, but his hand remained tight around it. "I want to call her." His friend held his gaze. "Then tell me what you are willing to hear if she says no." The question stayed between them. He looked at the photograph again, then at the blank message field. "I don't know." His friend did not rescue him from the silence. That was what he had always expected someone else to do. Fill the space, soften the truth, Give him a version of himself he could live with. He lowered the phone. I told everyone I had no regrets because I needed it to be true. His voice was quieter now. If I admitted I regretted leaving, then I'd have to admit she wasn't the problem. His friend remained still. He looked toward the drink that had been sitting untouched since they arrived. The ice was gone. What remained no longer looked like what he had ordered. Neither did he. "She didn't fail me," he said. The words seemed to cost him something. "I failed to protect what we had." There was no laughter around the table now. No one interrupted. The same people who had helped him rehearse his confidence were finally hearing what had been underneath it. He had been afraid of looking weak. Afraid that loving one person deeply would make him ordinary. Afraid his friends would see how much her opinion mattered to him. Their approval had been immediate. Simple. He could make a joke, complain about her, and receive agreement before the sentence was finished. Her love asked more of him. Patience, honesty, responsibility when no one was applauding. The reversed page of cups reflected the part of him that had avoided emotional maturity, not as a prediction, but as a psychological symbol of feelings handled carelessly, because admitting them felt too vulnerable. He had not lacked emotion. He had lacked the courage to carry it honestly. "What if she says it's too late?" he asked. His friend did not offer hope he could not promise. "Then it's too late." He looked away. "And what if she never answers?" "Then you live with that." The truth was not cruel. It was simply no longer designed to comfort him. The reversed Five of Pentacles had never been only about being left outside. The deeper punishment was knowing the warmth had once been his, and that he had walked away from it himself. He picked up the phone again, not to ask whether she missed him, not to explain how badly he was hurting, not to reopen the door she had worked so hard to close. He opened a new message. This time, he was not trying to win her back. He was trying to give her the apology she should have received, before she had to heal without it. He began with too many words. He explained how confused he had been. Deleted. He mentioned the pressure from his friends. Deleted. He wrote that losing her had finally made him understand. Then removed the part that asked whether understanding changed anything. It did not. He started again. "I dismissed your feelings. I shared things that should have stayed between us. I pulled away on purpose and blamed you for the distance I created it." He stopped. The message looked smaller than the harm, but adding more would not make it more honest. He typed that he was sorry, then deleted the sentence that followed. "I hope someday you can forgive me." That still asked something from her. He replaced it. "You do not owe me forgiveness, a reply, or another chance." His friend read his face, not the screen. "You ready to send it?" He looked at the button. No. For once, the answer was honest. The reversed page of wands reflected where he stood, not as a prediction, but as a psychological symbol of impulse finally interrupted. He had spent weeks wanting to act only when the feeling became unbearable. Call her. Check again. Say something that would make the discomfort disappear. Now he understood that urgency was not the same as readiness. He read the message one final time. There was no question at the end, no mention of how much he missed her, no request to explain whether she still cared. Only ownership, only apology. Only the truth without a hidden door inside it. His thumb hovered above the screen. He thought about the version of himself who had announced that he was happier, the one who laughed louder, stayed out later, and turned every doubt into another criticism of her. That version had not been exposed by a confession. He had been exposed by trembling hands, by an untouched drink, by 6 visits to the same profile, by every deleted message written after midnight. He had been busted by the silence he could not perform his way through. Then he pressed send. The message left the screen. No dramatic relief followed. No sign appeared to tell him he had done the right thing. The phone remained quiet. He placed it face down beside the glass and did not turn it over again. Outside the window, The night had grown colder. He noticed it without blaming anyone for the temperature. Regret could not purchase reconciliation. Insight could not erase consequence. And an apology, however honest, could not require the person it hurt to reopen the door. His spiral had begun when she stopped chasing him. His reckoning began when he finally stopped expecting her to return.